Historically, you will often hear individuals associate the beguiler or the serpent with Cain, and you'll hear about this Cain seed line. But what's noted is that with respect to this idea of beguiling, that appears to be something that is most associated in scripture with Shem and the Shem line. As a matter of fact, you have some association of that beguiling dynamic with Esau, but primarily you see it associated with Jacob because Jacob actually bears that name and that action. And you also see an interesting personification of this in the Marvel narrative, the Black Panther narrative for Injotica. And so we're going to be looking at this dynamic of Jacob actually being associated with this construct of the beguiler versus Ham. You often hear Ham associated with the beguiler or the serpent, or you will hear Cain associated with the Canaanites and ergo the serpent line. If you make note of the patterns of migration of people, and you make note of the desolation of lands, the destruction of people groups, the usurpation of indigenous people, you see a heavy presence of Shem. And so when you trace those lines in the Bible, and you see the names that go along with those lines, and you see those descent lines, you see a correlation with people groups that spread out, taking over the lands and the lives of people all over the world. And so this isn't just limited to the Jacob name. This is heavily associated with the Esau name and also with Ishmael and several other names. But you do see this heavy presence of Shem in terms of the destruction of this earth. And then symbolically, with respect to the Black Panther and Injotica or Killmonger, you see Marvel correlating Killmonger with this Jacob symbolism, and he's identified as having superior usurper skills. You also see here this correlation between Jacob and the serpent, as the serpent was described as crafty. And when you look at the meaning of Jacob, the operationalizing of this idea of Jacob, you see this construct of dealing in a crafty manner. You also see a correlation with this for Esau, but in terms of a name, it's the essence of Jacob's name, that idea of heel grabber. You also see this interesting association between Jacob and the serpent again, because at Genesis 3, you see this sort of curse that's being placed on the serpent. And so the serpent is cursed to be a heel grabber. And so the serpent is cursed to be sort of the rear guard, the following at the heel. And here again, you see this connection between the serpent and Jacob. You see this Akob, that's Jacob's name essentially, means last or liar in wait. Continuing on, you see this Akob, meaning supplanted. And so you can see that this also means to follow at the heel, to assail insidiously, to circumvent, and to overreach. And finally, of course, you see that it means to deal craftily. Now, some individuals are not willing to really face that this is what this is talking about, and that there is this correlation between Jacob and the essence of the serpent. So the essence of the serpent and the essence of Jacob are quite synonymous. But when individuals are so focused on trying to get themselves into position to be the chosen people, sometimes they overlook all of these nuances in the scripture that need to be addressed. And so you also see this new narrative, this symbolic narrative that has popped up for Killmonger that is in contrast to the original Marvel cartoon character. And so in this, you see these markings on Killmonger's body. These are supposed to be related to his warrior history. However, these markings also are supposed to be synonymous with a crocodile. But if you look at them, they also look substantially similar to some other things that you've been seeing in more recent narratives. But again, you see that he is identified as one having usurper skills, and you also see that he is then associated with this idea of Jacob, which means he's associated with the idea of ortho, which means he's associated with a number of other dynamics that are going on right now. And finally, you see this narrative from Marvel about Eric. His name is Eric Killmonger, Eric Stevens Njadaka Killmonger. In this, he indicates, I'm Eric. I grew up around the way from you in Harlem, probably referring to T'Challa. And he says, I'm the rightful head of the Wakandan Tribal Council. And so, as you can imagine, you see this battle between Njadaka and T'Challa over who is the rightful heir. And you see this same dynamic going on, of course, with Jacob and Esau. And with respect to this narrative, it appears that Njadaka would have been second or not first in line, but he ultimately becomes first. He becomes the Black Panther. Without spoiling too much of it, then he is no longer the Black Panther. But at some point in time, he actually does take on that role of Black Panther, and he takes on that role of the head. And he is seen in the Marvel narrative as a super supplanter. And so, of course, this brings up the question of how do you know throughout history when Jacob is actually operating as Jacob and Esau is actually operating as Esau? How do you know when Jacob is just being Jacob or when Jacob is perhaps acting as Esau? And because Esau is also correlated with this idea of dealing craftily or being deceitful, how do you know when Esau is actually being Esau or when Esau is actually pretending to be Jacob? Remember, knowledge is power. Take care, Season.